Welcome to the Open to Hope Show. I'm your host, Dr. Gloria Horsley, with my daughter and co-host,
Dr. Heidi Horsley.
This show is brought to you by the Open to Hope Foundation in partnership with the Compassionate Friends. Well, Heidi, we're going to have a show today that you've been long wanting to have a show on, right?
Yes, and when our two guests pitched it to me, I said yes, because one, I've been talking about this for such a long time. We've never done a show on it, and it is about loss and its impact on parenting.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to have two guests on today, and one of them lost her brother, and one of them lost her mother. And I, of course, lost my brother. You lost your son. And it has impacted the way all of us parent the children that we have right now. So it's impacted it in so many ways, and different things keep coming up in our lives depending on how old our children are, our surviving children, in your case. So our guests are going to be Rachel Stephenson, who did a TED Talk called Against Grieving in Silence. And we've had her on the show before, and her mother died when she was only 5 years old. And then we are also going to talk with Elizabeth DeVita-Raeburn, who is a good friend of mine I've known for many years. Elizabeth has also been on our show before, and she is the author of The Empty Room, Understanding Sibling Loss. I always say this is the best sibling loss book out there. The best, get it. She interviewed 77 siblings. One of them was me many years ago. It's such a great read. If you've had a sibling die or if you want to understand sibling loss, please get the book. And she's also written a new book, which is pretty groundbreaking.
Oh, yeah. It's an amazing book, The Death of Cancer. It is such an interesting book. And what's really exciting about it, in my mind, is Elizabeth wrote it with her dad.
Absolutely, and I think that's incredible. And Elizabeth lost her brother, Ted. He was only 17 years old, and she was 14 at the time. And a movie was made about his death, and it was loosely based on The Boy in the Bubble with John Travolta. Because her brother was in a bubble room for years.
Right.
So, okay, welcome to the show.
Thank you
Hey,
so much.
Rachel and Elizabeth, it's great having you guys on.
So it's such a privilege to be able to talk about this subject in particular.
I know, I love this. Okay, so we are talking about the way parenting is the way that your loss has impacted parenting. So Rachel, why don't you tell us a little bit about your loss, and Elizabeth, tell us about yours, and then tell us about the ways that your loss has impacted the way that you parent.
Sure. So, some of the key elements of my loss story
Yeah.
when it comes to my mom is that, she died suddenly when I was only 5. And one of the things that I talk about now when reflecting on the loss is that, it was many years before I knew what happened. So there's something about truth-telling. Especially when children lose people they love. So that's part of my narrative, and it's part of what I reflect a lot on. So in terms of parenting, I think one of the core values that I have 3 daughters, they're 12, 8, and 4. One of the core values that I have now is telling the truth, talking about really hard things, never shying away from difficult subjects. And, my father died a few years ago, and part of the story I tell is the fact that his death was a result of very self-destructive behaviors, substance abuse, alcoholism, that I link in many ways to repressed grief that he experienced his whole life, and an unwillingness and inability to really confront his grief. So of course, watching what happened to him and seeing how our relationship evolved over time because of that repressed grief and that inability to confront the truth, that too, plays into my life as a parent and the things that I really want to be able to talk to my kids about.
So when you were growing up, and as you got older, and I'm sure your understanding of your mom's death changed as you got older, were you given accurate, age-appropriate information, or was a lot hidden from you?
Well, the bottom line is that my family, they were so shocked and horrified by what happened that I think in the haze of grief, they didn't quite explain what happened. And, I found out arbitrarily from a cousin who happened to tell me the truth. And I don't, no one ever made an intentional decision to withhold information or keep a secret.
What was the truth, and how did she give it to you?
Good point. My mother died in a car accident. The night of her death, when my grandmother, who was watching over me as my parents were out having fun, as she was called to the hospital, she leaned into the bed where I was sleeping, and she simply told me, "I have to go, your mommy's sick." The next morning when she and my dad returned, they told me your mommy's in heaven now. She's with the angels. Wow. So, you know, these euphemisms were used to describe what happened. And they never, I don't think they ever realized that I didn't quite know what had taken place.
Wow.
So it's not a story of deception or intentional manipulation of facts. It's simply a story of, you know, what grief can do, right? Yeah. And it's a reminder that we need to be really explicit, especially with children.
Well, sometimes kids, their memories and their thoughts, their fantasies go into really scary places when you don't tell them. And they think there's someone lurking around the bushes, it's going to grab you. I mean, all sorts of things. What happened? I don't know if you ever thought about, well, what did happen to her?
Well, I imagined her in her bed with a thermometer in her mouth, you know, like a fever. You know, like she was sick, because that's all I heard as my grandmother walked out of the room, right? So I had these fantasies in my mind about what she looked like, was she shivering? And you know, as I think back on my own life, I definitely internalized a lot of fear about unexpected things can happen, and related to health. You know, I struggled with hypochondria. Oh my gosh, I struggled with hypochondria for so many years. And it's clear now why, but at the time I wasn't quite aware of it. But that kind of awareness too about how the things we say and don't say can have an impact on our kids, that's something I carry with me every day. And so don't want there to be any, I want there to be complete transparency about every aspect of our lives together.
Yeah, I love that. Okay, Elizabeth, then tell us a little bit about Ted.
Ted was my older brother. He was 17 when he died. I was 14 when he died. I was 6 when he got sick. He was 9, just shy of 10. And he had a severe immune deficiency disorder and lived in the hospital from the point of his diagnosis on. And I completely relate to what you were saying. I think I was told he was sick and he would be in the hospital for a while. But in the stress of the ongoing situation, he was sick for 8.5 years. No one ever updated that knowledge for me. So I didn't really know that it was possible he would die. I just assumed that at some point he was getting out, and this was kind of a normal type of life. So I was, even though it was an illness, I was stunned.
He'd kind of grow out of it eventually. He would grow out of it eventually.
Yeah, he would just get better. Eventually they'd fix it. And you know, to me, this was normal. I look at pictures now and he looks very pale in the hospital, and I can see this is a sick child, but to me this just became a normal. We went to his hospital room every day, and this is just the way things were. And so I was absolutely stunned when he died. And it took me a while to realize that I didn't have the full knowledge or didn't have a way to process it, and that people hadn't been aware of the sort of inner life, my inner life as a child, trying to make sense of all of this. So I had to make sense of it as an adult, well before I had children. I'm really glad I did that before I had children.
Now, does it scare you? Does it impact your parenting as far as, are you worried? I know Ted started out with bruises on his body. Do you worry about your kid's immune disease? And then I would ask you, after she comments, do you worry about your kids in automobiles? And do you worry about your kids driving? And, you know, how does it impact that fear kind
and
of
Elizabeth
thing?
has 2 boys right now. And how old are they?
The younger guy is 7, the older one's 10.
So how old was Ted when he...
He was 9, almost 10, and I was 6. So for the past year, I've actually been having a difficult time. I didn't see it coming, just getting kind of flashback feelings. And I realized that it's, you know, it's been because they've been drifting through this age phase that my brother and I were in. And I look at my, you know, he's 7 now, but 6-year-old, and I see the emotional climate, however you want to describe it, of a child that age and how they process things and feel things and misconstrue things. And it's like a window into who I was and where I was at the time that my brother's illness happened. So it's been a little mind-bendy, But to answer your question, I worry. Like I kind of have tried to train myself to not overreact, but when I, you know, boys, you know, it's the bruises and cuts and, you know, all that kind of thing. A lot of things I was okay with, a cut, okay, a bruise really bothered me. And I'd have to be like, most bruises are just bruises. You know, like there's like a training to step back the anxiety when I feel it coming.
So you're able to be aware of it and say, okay, I'm not going to overreact.
Yeah, I can't say that I'm always so good at catching it in the moment as I was with the bruise. Like the bruise was such an obvious connection for me. There have been other times when I think it's been less obvious for me, and I had to realize, oh, I'm really anxious. What is it about this scenario or this situation? And it always leads back to my brother or that situation.
How about you, Rachel? Are you?
No, definitely. Elizabeth's point about having a window into the life and mind of her own kids and helping that to connect to her life as a child. You know, I turned 5, and 3 days later my mother was killed.
Wow.
So every time one of my daughters has turned 5, I count down 3, 2, 1. You know, that day, that literally to the hour, because it was in the middle of the night, and I think to myself, it's 1 in the morning. My kid is 5 years and 3 days old. This is the moment when when my mother disappeared out of my life. And I think about how young they are. You know, I mean, at this point, my older daughter is 12. My middle daughter is 8. My youngest daughter's 4. She'll be 5 next year. So I feel like I'm about to hit that last milestone of that turning 5. And on the one hand, it's made me realize, oh my God, they are so young. And I realize why I only have 10 or so memories of my mother. And it's devastating because I think, you know, in the case of my 4-year-old now, I've lived every day of her life with her and I feel so connected to her. But if I were to go away today, what would she remember? On the flip side, however, my mother is such a presence in my life, despite the fact that I only have 10 memories of her. And I've read before that the shaping and nurturing that happens in our youngest years, our earliest years, so form who we are that I feel like she has made this mark on my life and who I am that will never go away, despite the fact that I only have 10 memories. So on the one hand, I'm horrified at how young they were, how young I was. On the other hand, I'm so comforted because I know how present she is, and if I were to suddenly disappear, I wouldn't be gone from their lives. The point you made, Heidi, about an awareness of what you might fear, I try not to be afraid of car rides and crossing the street and bad things happening in a split second because I know that could potentially be paralyzing for me and for them. And because I struggled with hypochondria, you know, I fight that fear. I don't want to live with fear. I want to live.
And it's interesting because you didn't know what happened, it was more of the fear of the illness piece.
That's right.
And how scary is it to think somebody goes to sleep and dies and gets ill and dies? I would be afraid to sleep.
Right.
You know, you hear of kids having sleep issues because they've heard that grandma died peacefully in her sleep.
Right. Right. It's true.
I'm not going to sleep.
Makes complete sense.
And it's opened up conversations with us about risk. Like I talk very honestly with my girls about risk.
Yeah.
And I hear them talk about it too. You know, my oldest daughter was saying recently she talked to some friends who were worried about something. She said, you know what, we walk down the street, something could happen, but we can't not walk down the street.
Right.
So I think, wow, if you have that ability to talk in that way at 12, I feel like that's in some ways it's a gift.
It is.
You know, and my loss, I feel like has been a gift for me because I think I'm a more aware, present parent than I would be otherwise.
That's one thing I want to get to is the gifts of loss, because I think there are some strengths that we derive from maybe earlier losses. But I wanted to ask, did you see your mother's body?
No.
Yeah, and did you see Ted?
I was with my brother when he died.
Oh, so you were with him?
I saw Scott's body.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that's interesting too. I would guess it's difficult sometimes to know that they're really even dead if you.
It's true.
If you didn't see.
And I asked about it.
Particularly for a 5-year-old.
You know, when confronting some of the secrecy later in life, it was explained to me by people who I know loved me and wanted to protect me that it was simply to keep me away from the pain. It was a protective gesture.
Right.
But I rage against that. I mean, and that's why now I say things that, you know, some parents might be like, oh my God, you're talking to your kids about that? Yeah, I'm talking to my kids about that.
I agree.
Well, when Scott died, he and my cousin died together. They were both 17 in a car accident. And I was 20, so I wasn't 5 years old. But I honestly believed that someone had kidnapped them and because the car they were in blew up, and put somebody else in that car, and that they really weren't dead. You know, because your mind won't wrap around the fact that it could have happened in an instant. So for me, seeing the body was important because I really didn't believe it was them. For me, about the parenting piece that has come up recently, and Elizabeth knows this because we've talked about this before, my brother and cousin died at 17 in a car. Boys, 17 cars. It's a dangerous pairing for me. So my son Alexander turned 17 a year and a half ago. He's 18 now, thank goodness. But for the entire year, I was stressed out. I'm like, everyone's like, oh, it's great, he's 17. I'm like, no, this is a dangerous year for me. This is the year that 17-year-old boys in my family die. And, you know, I didn't tell him that, but I was telling myself that, and I was very stressed out, and he didn't get his license, and he still doesn't have it, although he's going to get it. We do live in Midtown Manhattan, so you don't need a license. He did call me the other day and say, Mom, it's time, and it is time. And that was my issues, because I was so afraid he was going to get in a car accident.
So were you consciously aware that whole year, this is what this is about? Or were you
Yes.
just anxious and you finally realized that that's what it was?
I knew the whole year that it was what it was about, and I also knew that I didn't want him to get a license.
Yeah. Well, I remember talking to you when you were pregnant with Alexander. That's when we first met.
Yeah.
And you were talking about being worried about that even then.
I was.
Wow.
About him and his
You were
license?
6 months pregnant, and you're like, I'm really worried about, when it's time for him to drive.
That's
Wow.
amazing.
I'll go find my transcripts. I know you talked
That's
about
amazing. So in 1997, I was worried about that.
Yeah.
That's incredible. I believe
Yeah.
you.
Yeah.
It's interesting how our losses do impact the way that we parent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
How about you, Mom?
Oh,
You had
lots
3
of
surviving children.
Yeah, there's a lot of anxiety, right after they die. I don't know, if you found that, but after you have a child die, and I would guess a sibling, I don't know what the sibling's anxiety is, but the parent's anxiety is we're supposed to take care of our kids. I mean, if you were really a good parent, your kids would not die.
Did you have a fear that another child would die?
Yeah, well, I remember the anxiety for Heather was living home with us, and you guys were in college, and it probably had been about 3 weeks, and Heather went, and it was before cell phones, and that could be a whole other issue about cell phones, but it was before cell phones, and she went to a party, and one of Scott's friends came over to visit, and I was panicked, and I said, I don't know where Heather is. I think it was only 9 o'clock at night. And so he went, he said, let me try to find her. And so he went to different friends' houses where I thought she was and saw her and talked to her and came back and said she's fine.
Wow.
But I was in a panic. And it's hard to...
Well, for me, I'm not so much worried about something bad happening to them. I'm worried about something bad happening to me.
That makes sense.
Yeah,
Right?
that
That
makes
was
So
your
that they
reality.
become motherless children.
Yeah.
Just
That
like
makes
I
sense.
was a motherless child.
That makes sense.
Right,
Yeah.
absolutely.
But I wasn't a motherless child, but I still worried about that. Like I had, the whole bad mammogram scenario a few years ago, which turned out fine. But it took a couple of months to figure that out. And during that time, I was completely a wreck and paralyzed because I thought my kids are going to grow up with this legacy of grief that I grew up with, and there'll be no one to help them with it who understands it.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's interesting. That's big.
Yeah, a legacy of grief. That's an interesting. So, what do you think? What kinds of qualities have you developed because of this that you see in yourself that you don't see in other people?
Well, I know. I mean, there's a story that comes to mind for me. My middle daughter, 8 years old, just this past year, her teacher wrote me this beautiful email. I mean, just, in response to something that happened that day. The kids were reading a book about family secrets, actually. And my daughter started to disclose to the class, my mom lost her mom when she was little. There was a secret she didn't know. And the teacher described, like, the kids on the edge of their seats, like, oh my God, what is she about to talk about? And she talked about my daughter's willingness to say, my mom talks about it now, it was painful, she needed to know. And that was a gift to that class. And the teacher said that a lot of those kids seemed to know that there were secrets in their family or things they didn't know. And the fact that something was out there and that this 8-year-old could talk about it openly was really intriguing to them. So I think in terms of characteristics, it's just a willingness to talk about hard things and to try to communicate to kids that, this isn't, it's hard, but it's a necessity. And the flip side of loss is love, right? And so if we don't lose, if we don't fear, if we don't mourn, we don't understand what the other side of it is, which is relationships and, the gift of love in our lives. And so I think what I want to say to them and what I want them to say to their peers and the people they choose, their partners, their own children, is that we need to be comfortable dealing with hard things.
Yep.
It's not going to be comfortable, but we need to just let ourselves go to those places because then life is richer.
I like that.
Yeah, Elizabeth, how about you?
Well, I agree with the point that I talk to my kids about difficult topics. I talk about my brother. I tell them what happened, not in an excessive way, but just to understand who he was and his presence in our life, how it shaped me, that we talk about difficult things and that we grow from them. I think also having lost as a child, I have a lot of empathy for my kids and a willingness and desire to really tune into what their emotional state is and what they're feeling and not to discount it and ignore it because I am aware of how much people were unaware of what my experience was as a kid. So I try and kind of get in that space with them. So I think that's kind of one of the gifts that I've
So the empathy.
And I agree with both of you. I mean, I talk a lot more candidly and open with my kids, and I want them to know their uncle.
yeah.
So, you know, I bring them up and I talk about them, and they know what happened. And it's funny because Samantha will write me cards and she'll say, Mommy, Uncle Scott is watching over you. He hasn't forgotten about you. He wants you to know he still remembers you. And I love that because it's a flip of, you know, what you would usually hear, but they're used to talking about that. But the other thing for me, and it sounds like you guys are feeling the same way, I really appreciate my kids because I don't take it for granted that they're in my life every day because my brother died at 17. So I just look at them and go, oh, wow, they're here in my life. This is such a gift. And I know that's because, number one, I know the depth of a parent's love and a sibling love. And, you know, we come from a place of loss. So we appreciate what we have when we have it.
It's true. I mean, some of the exercises that kids do, I know in school, it's these small moments. You know, like what's a picture of a small moment? Small moment essays.
Yep.
And I think I see through that lens a lot. Like this is a small moment I want to remember. I want to savor this. And it's almost like a piece of art. You know, like they're here, we're talking, we're touching. Even skin on skin, cuddles. I mean, just moments that you remember. You don't lose sight of the significance of those moments in your life.
And I'm thinking you probably feel very connected to the mother-child bond, the mother-daughter bond.
Oh, yeah.
I bet there's moments where you're holding your kids and kind of thinking about your own mom.
Well, I even talk about the future. You know, I'm like, I want to be with you when you have a kid, if you choose to have a kid. You know, I want to be in the room. I want talk to me about this. You know, they're starting to talk about crushes that they have, and I was like, let's keep this going. This matters to me. And I think sometimes it may make them uncomfortable. Like my oldest daughter has definitely told me that I overanalyze, and I'm like overly involved in the emotional significance of the moment. Partly that's just who I am, but I think in a big way it's because I want to make meaning in moments.
Yeah.
And I want them to know I want to be with them in the future and that I have a vision for our future together as mother and daughter. And I want them to hold on to that so that that stuff comes to life one day, you know?
And in the same vein, Elizabeth, what about the sibling bond of your own children? Does that bring up stuff? I mean, I know there's fighting, but you know, there's also loving, right?
Yeah, but I have to say one of the most humbling aspects of being a parent of two children for me has been that I just thought, you know, I wrote a book about siblings. I spent so much time thinking about siblings. It was really important to me that they, you know, I had siblings. I had two children who had one another, and then they fought like crazy. And I thought, I have no idea how to foster a good sibling relationship. With all the thought that I've given this, I have no idea what to do about this. And they fought like crazy, crazy.
Yeah.
It's
Well,
gotten
you and
better
Ted
now.
couldn't fight. He was in a bubble room.
Yeah, no, we couldn't touch one another. So yeah, we fought like crazy before then, actually. But.
You know, all of these losses, you don't have the time to work out those relationships, which is, you know, one of the things. You don't have time to yell at your mother and get mad at her and be a brat and, you know, and be forgiven. And, you know, these relationships, they get cut off from going through the ugly times.
Yeah,
and,
that's true.
you know, going through everything. So.
Well, for me, I you know, our decisions change on so many levels. I mean, I would have not had two children had my brother not died. And you guys, Elizabeth, you know the story, but you know, after Alexander was born, I was going to have another child. I had planned it out. I mean, my life is about siblings and sibling loss. And I had years of infertility and 2 miscarriages. Ended up, and I said to my husband's like, Heidi, we have one great son. That's fine. It's all good. Let's just, you know, it was meant to be this way. I said, Marcus, come hell or high water, I'm getting a sibling for this child. So in 2006, my sister and I flew to China and adopted baby girls together so that our sons could have a sister. And yeah, it was really important to me that Alexander have a sibling. It was very important. And just seeing them together and hearing them together brings back all the memories of growing up with siblings. So, and like I said, had Scott never been in my life, I would have probably had one kid today. So.
Well, for me, having 3 daughters, too, because it was the mother-daughter thing that I missed. So the first child was a daughter. I thought, thank you, because I want that mother-daughter bond, you know? And then the second was a daughter. Thank you again. And then the third, another daughter. I mean, I just feel like it's this luxury of mother-daughter for me. But I also wanted more. I was an only child. So, you know, I was alone. My father was emotionally unavailable to me in ways that, you know, were real. And so for me, having multiple kids was creating family and thinking about the multiplying effect of their kids in my life, and you know, just wanting to build the family that
that makes sense.
didn't feel I had.
Well, before we end the show, I want to make sure we get in. Where can people get your TED Talk and say what the name of it is? It's a great talk.
Yeah, thank you. So the talk is Against Grieving in Silence, which can easily be Googled, YouTube, Against Grieving in Silence, TEDx. I also have a Facebook page, Rachel Stephenson.
Okay, great.
I have 2 books, The Empty Room. It's my Sibling Loss book and The Death of Cancer, and they're both available on Amazon.
Talk about writing a book with your dad now. Speaking of sibling loss, your father is one of the major cancer researchers in the world.
It was actually an incredible, amazing experience.
Tell your dad's name and what he's headed.
Okay, so his name's Vincent DeVita. He created the first combination chemotherapy to cure an adult cancer back in the late 60s, which was an astronomical move forward at the time, because at that point we only had really surgery and radiation. And so it started moving us. Not only could it cured 80% of people at a time when people weren't being cured with metastatic cancer.
And I told you he cured little Belle, your cousin.
Amazing.
But it created an area where they could move this into other types of cancer. So.
And you wrote this wonderful book with him. How was it?
The book was a great experience. Everyone keeps asking us, like, how was it? Like it's going to be like, this horror show. But it was great, and I got to learn about his life in a way that I think a lot of children don't get to learn about their parents' lives.
Fantastic. And there's just a very small section about Ted you slipped in there.
Well, we talked about that, and I don't think he would have been so eager to write about it. But I was like, this was happening while you were there doing your research. He was a floor below you at the Institute. There's no way you can talk about your life and career and slip that piece out of it.
Anyway, the Death of Cancer and your book, The Empty Room, you can get on Amazon, right? Well, listen, thank you both for being on the show. It's just been great having you on and hearing your thoughts about parenting.
Thanks, Rachel and Elizabeth. I'm glad we finally did this.
Yeah, me too.
Thank you so much.
That's great.
And we want to thank you for watching this show today. And as Heidi and I always want to remind you, if you've lost hope, please visit us at opentohope.com and lean on our hope until you find your own. And God bless.